There's a battle happening right now, not in some distant land, not on a screen, not in the headlines. It's happening inside you, in the space between stimulus and response, in the moment when you choose to scroll past suffering instead of feeling it, in the breath you take before deciding whether to forgive or harden, in the quiet turning inward when you could reach outward. C.S. Lewis understood this war better than almost anyone who's ever written about the human condition. And the most unsettling thing he discovered? The real enemy isn't violence. It isn't even evil in its dramatic, obvious forms. The real enemy is numbness, the slow, subtle drift into spiritual anesthesia where you stop feeling, stop caring, stop fighting for your own soul. Tonight, we're going to explore the philosophy of internal warfare that Lewis developed over decades of brutal self-examination. A philosophy forged in the trenches of World War I, refined in the crucible of personal loss, and articulated with devastating clarity for anyone brave enough to look honestly at what's happening beneath the surface of their daily life. This isn't about distant theological abstractions. It's about the war you're fighting right now, whether you realize it or not. If you're finding value in these explorations, I'd genuinely appreciate a like or maybe a subscription. It makes a bigger difference than you might think. I'm always curious, where are you right now? Drop a comment with your city and the current time there. There's something beautiful about our scattered community coming together through these late-night philosophical journeys. Now, settle in. Dim those lights if you can. Maybe let some gentle background sound wash over you. And let's begin tonight's exploration together. We're going to discover why Lewis believed that the most important battles you'll ever fight happen in moments so small you might not even notice them, and why losing those battles slowly, quietly, day after day, leads to something far worse than dramatic defeat. Part 1. The Architecture of Inner Collapse. The story begins not with philosophy, but with mud. Picture this. It's 1917, and a young C.S. Lewis stands in a trench somewhere in France. He's 18 years old, commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Somerset Light Infantry. The war that was supposed to be over by Christmas has ground into its third year of mechanized slaughter. Lewis has read Homer and Virgil, Milton and Dante. He knows all the glorious myths of war, the heroic narratives, the beautiful lies. And now, he's standing in actual war. And it's nothing like the stories. It's not glory. It's not noble sacrifice. It's men's bodies torn apart by artillery. It's the smell of death so thick you can taste it. It's the random, meaningless distribution of survival and annihilation. A shell lands here instead of there, and you live while your friend dies, for no reason at all. No heroism, no meaning, just chaos and meat. But here's what Lewis noticed in those trenches, something that would haunt him for the rest of his life and shape everything he'd eventually write about human nature. The real horror wasn't the violence itself. The human mind could, in some terrible way, adapt even to that. The real horror was what happened to you internally when you adapted. The slow hardening, the gradual shutdown of empathy, the creeping numbness that let you function in hell by ceasing to feel anything at all. Lewis watched it happen to himself and to the men around him. You'd see a body, someone who'd been alive and laughing hours ago, and you'd feel less. Not nothing, not at first, but less than you should, less than you wanted to, and the next time, even less. Your humanity wasn't being destroyed by some external enemy. It was being surrendered, piece by piece, in the name of psychological survival. You were numbing yourself to keep functioning, and in the process, you were becoming something other than human. This was the first great insight that would shape Lewis's mature philosophy. The enemy wasn't out there. The enemy was the slow internal process by which you became capable of enduring the unendurable by ceasing to be fully human. The real warfare wasn't against Germans. It was against your own emotional and spiritual death. The psychological mechanism Lewis identified was what he'd later call the great anesthetic, the mind's capacity to protect itself from overwhelming pain by shutting down feeling altogether. It wasn't a conscious choice. It happened automatically, like a circuit breaker tripping when the current gets too strong. Your consciousness simply couldn't process the horror, so it stopped processing anything deeply. You moved through the world functionally, but without genuine engagement. You performed tasks, but without presence. You survived, but without really living. What made this particularly insidious was that the numbness felt like strength. The man who could look at carnage without flinching seemed tougher, more suited to war, more masculine than the man who still felt horror. The culture of the trenches rewarded emotional shutdown and mocked sensitivity. You learned quickly not to show feeling, not to care too obviously, not to let death affect you visibly. This created a feedback loop where numbness begat more numbness, and anyone still capable of feeling deeply seemed weak and unsuited to reality. Lewis recognized this pattern would continue long after the war ended. The men who'd learned to numb themselves in the trenches wouldn't suddenly recover full emotional capacity when they returned home. They'd carry that protective shutdown into their marriages, their friendships, their relationships with their children. They'd be present physically, but absent emotionally, going through the motions of civilian life while remaining spiritually in that trench, still protecting themselves from overwhelming feeling by refusing to feel much of anything. He saw it in the veterans who came back changed, unable to explain what had happened to them, unable to reconnect with people who hadn't shared their experience. They weren't suffering from obvious trauma. They functioned, held jobs, maintained households. But something essential had been lost. The capacity for joy had been sacrificed along with the capacity for grief. The shield they'd constructed against horror also blocked out beauty, love, meaning. They'd purchased survival at the cost of their own souls. Lewis came home from the war, physically intact, but internally shattered. Like so many veterans of that catastrophic conflict, he carried wounds that weren't visible. But unlike many, he had the intellectual tools and the brutal honesty to examine what had happened to him. And what he found terrified him more than the shells had. He'd gone to war as a young atheist who believed the universe was fundamentally meaningless, that human consciousness was an accident of chemistry and physics, that moral values were subjective preferences. The war should have confirmed this worldview. Instead, it created a philosophical crisis. Because Lewis found that he couldn't maintain his atheistic materialism while also maintaining his conviction that what he'd witnessed was genuinely wrong. Not just unpleasant or unfortunate, but objectively, terribly wrong. If the universe really was meaningless, if morality was just subjective preference, then why did the meaningless slaughter feel like a violation of something fundamental? Why did the numbness feel like a betrayal of something essential to being human? Lewis's philosophical framework said these were just feelings, chemical responses in the brain, signifying nothing. But the feelings themselves insisted they signified everything. This tension between the worldview his intellect had adopted and the moral intuitions his experience insisted on became the crack through which light would eventually enter. But for years, Lewis tried to seal that crack, to maintain his atheistic certainty against the mounting evidence of his own experience. He returned to Oxford to complete his studies and eventually secured a position teaching English literature. On the surface, he was a success, brilliant, productive, respected by colleagues. But internally, he was engaged in a desperate holding action, trying to prevent his atheism from collapsing under the weight of his own moral sense, his appreciation of beauty, his longing for meaning that naturalistic explanations couldn't satisfy. Lewis later described this period as characterized by a zoo of lusts, a bedlam of ambitions, a nursery of fears, a harem of fondled hatreds. The language is vivid and unsettling because Lewis wanted to convey the actual chaos of unconverted consciousness. He wasn't being dramatic or exaggerating for effect. He was trying to make people understand what most of us carefully hide from ourselves: the sheer disorder and conflict within unredeemed human psychology. The war within wasn't just between good and evil in some simple, obvious way. It was between different parts of himself that wanted contradictory things, held incompatible beliefs, and couldn't achieve any stable peace or integration. His intellect insisted the universe was meaningless. His moral sense insisted some things were genuinely right and wrong. His aesthetic experiences suggested reality had meaning and purpose. His desires pointed toward fulfillment that nothing material could provide. And underneath it all was that numbness, that creeping deadness, that slow process of becoming less than human in order to function in a world his philosophy said was fundamentally absurd. This is what Lewis eventually came to understand as the foundational human condition. Not specific sins or vices, but internal fragmentation, contradiction, and the progressive loss of full humanity through various forms of self-protection and self-deception. The war within wasn't an occasional flare-up when you faced temptation. It was the constant, grinding background condition of human existence. The trenches had revealed something to Lewis that most people spend their lives avoiding: the precarious nature of human consciousness, how quickly and easily it could be damaged, how vulnerable you were to your own protective mechanisms, how the very strategies you employed to survive could destroy what made survival worthwhile. He'd seen men become shells of themselves, physically alive but spiritually dead, and he'd felt the same process beginning in himself. This understanding would eventually become central to everything Lewis wrote about moral psychology and spiritual development. The war within wasn't fought primarily against external temptations or obvious vices. It was fought against the slow internal collapse that happened when you protected yourself from feeling, when you hardened yourself against vulnerability, when you numbed yourself to avoid pain. The enemy was the gradual loss of full humanity through small compromises and protective mechanisms that seemed necessary for survival, but actually constituted a kind of living death. Part 2. The Anatomy of Self-Deception. Lewis's breakthrough came through his study of literature, not through abstract philosophy. As a scholar of medieval and Renaissance texts, he was immersed in works that assumed a very different worldview than modern materialism. These older writers took for granted that reality had objective meaning and purpose, that moral values were discoverable features of existence, that human beings were designed for something specific and suffered when they lived contrary to their design. Lewis noticed something strange. When he approached these texts with his atheistic assumptions, they seemed primitive, naive, the product of less enlightened times. But when he temporarily suspended those assumptions and tried to see from within the worldview the texts assumed, they became profound, psychologically sophisticated, offering insights about human nature that modern psychology was just beginning to rediscover. This created a peculiar situation. Lewis was supposed to be the enlightened modern explaining to students how medieval writers got things wrong. But increasingly, he felt like the medieval writers understood something essential about human experience that modernity had forgotten or deliberately ignored. They saw patterns Lewis recognized in himself, but his philosophy said didn't exist. The key pattern was what Lewis eventually called the bent nature of human consciousness. Medieval and classical writers assumed that human beings were designed for a particular way of being, oriented toward truth, goodness, beauty, and ultimately toward God as the source of these qualities. But they also recognized that actual human beings were consistently, systematically bent away from this proper orientation. Not completely turned away. People still recognized and valued truth, goodness, and beauty. But they were bent so that they approached these values from angles, pursuing distorted versions of them, settling for counterfeits, and perpetually sabotaging their own fulfillment. This wasn't just weakness or ignorance that could be fixed through better education or more willpower. It was something deeper, more systematic, built into the structure of fallen human consciousness. Lewis found this diagnosis uncomfortable because it implied that he couldn't trust his own thoughts, desires, and perceptions to give him accurate information about reality or even about his own good. His consciousness itself was compromised, bent, systematically distorted. Modern psychology was beginning to discover similar patterns through different methods. Freud had identified unconscious motivations and defense mechanisms. Jung explored shadow aspects of personality. But these thinkers explained the patterns through naturalistic frameworks, evolutionary development, childhood experiences, social conditioning. Lewis began to wonder if these naturalistic explanations were themselves symptoms of the bent consciousness they claimed to explain. The process of self-deception that Lewis identified operated at multiple levels simultaneously. There was the obvious level of conscious lying to yourself, knowing the truth, but refusing to admit it. Like when you know you're being cruel, but tell yourself you're just being honest. But beneath that was something more subtle, the systematic distortion of perception itself, so that you genuinely didn't see what was there to be seen. Lewis illustrated this with various examples from his own experience and observation. A person consumed by pride might genuinely not notice their own arrogance, not because they're hiding it from themselves, but because pride itself warps perception so that their inflated self-importance seems like objective assessment. Someone trapped in lust might genuinely believe their obsession is true love, not because they're lying, but because lust systematically blinds people to the difference. An ambitious person might sincerely think they're serving others when they're actually manipulating everyone toward their own advancement. The insidious thing about this deeper self-deception was that rational arguments and evidence couldn't easily penetrate it. You could show the proud person evidence of their pride, but they'd interpret it differently, find alternative explanations, defend their perception. The problem wasn't lack of information, but a systematic bias in how information was processed and interpreted. Lewis found this insight in various forms throughout classical and Christian thought, but he brought to it a modern psychological sophistication that made it newly powerful. He showed how self-deception operated through what we'd now call cognitive biases, defense mechanisms, and motivated reasoning. But he insisted these mechanisms themselves needed explanation. Why were human minds systematically biased in these particular ways? Why did the distortions follow predictable patterns rather than being random errors? The naturalistic explanation was that these biases had evolutionary origins. They'd helped our ancestors survive and reproduce, even if they didn't track objective truth. But Lewis found this explanation unsatisfying, for the same reason he'd found evolutionary ethics unsatisfying. If our cognitive mechanisms were designed by natural selection for survival rather than for truth tracking, why should we trust any of our beliefs, including our belief in evolution and naturalism? The position seemed self-undermining. Lewis began considering an alternative. What if human consciousness was designed for truth, but had been systematically damaged or bent so that it malfunctioned in predictable ways? This would explain both why we could still recognize and value truth when we encountered it, and why we were simultaneously so prone to systematic errors and self-deceptions. We weren't random accidents that happened to stumble toward approximate truths. We were damaged instruments that still partially functioned, but consistently misread reality in characteristic ways. This diagnosis of human consciousness had enormous implications for how Lewis understood the internal war. The enemy wasn't just particular temptations or vices you could identify and fight directly. The enemy was the systematic distortion of perception that made you unable to see accurately what you were doing or becoming. You couldn't win a war when your intelligence reports were systematically compromised at the source. Lewis identified several characteristic patterns of this distorted perception. One was what he called the inner ring, the human tendency to be obsessed with getting inside whatever group seemed to confer status and belonging, to the point where this quest distorted all other values and relationships. People would sacrifice principles, betray friends, compromise, integrity, all for the sake of being accepted by some imagined inner circle. And the worst part was that they rarely recognized this as what they were doing. They had elaborate rationalizations that made their behavior seem reasonable, even virtuous. The inner ring operated through a sophisticated form of self-deception. You told yourself you were pursuing the friendship, or the professional opportunity, or the intellectual stimulation that membership in this group would provide. But actually, you were pursuing the status, the sense of belonging to an elite, the psychological satisfaction of being in rather than out. The true motivation remained hidden from conscious awareness, protected by layers of rationalization. Lewis had observed this pattern throughout his academic career. He saw brilliant scholars compromise their intellectual integrity to gain acceptance from the right circles. He watched people adopt fashionable opinions they didn't actually believe, because those opinions marked membership in prestigious intellectual communities. He noticed how easily the quest for truth could be subordinated to the quest for status, and how rarely people recognize this substitution in themselves. The war within, at this level, involved fighting against your own need for belonging and status recognition. You had to be willing to remain outside the inner ring, to be considered naive or unsophisticated or not properly enlightened, if that's what intellectual integrity required. This was extraordinarily difficult because the need for belonging and status was so deep, so tied to self-worth, that giving it up felt like psychological suicide. Another pattern Lewis identified was what he called chronological snobbery, the assumption that newer ideas were inherently superior to older ones, that modernity had progressed beyond the insights of previous eras. This wasn't just intellectual error, but moral laziness, because it allowed people to dismiss traditional wisdom without actually examining it. Why engage seriously with Aristotle or Augustine when you could simply assume they were products of less enlightened times and therefore not worth serious consideration? Lewis recognized this tendency in himself during his atheistic period. He'd dismissed religious and philosophical traditions spanning millennia without seriously investigating whether they might contain insights his modern framework missed. The dismissal was based not on careful examination, but on the assumption that anything old must be primitive, anything religious must be superstitious, anything pre-scientific must be naive. When Lewis finally began examining these traditions seriously, he found them far more sophisticated than he'd assumed. Medieval thinkers had grappled with problems of consciousness, free will, moral psychology, and the nature of reality with a subtlety and depth that often exceeded modern treatments of the same questions. Their conclusions differed from modern materialist assumptions, but not because they were less intelligent or less rigorous. They were working with different starting points and different evidence, particularly the evidence of inner experience that materialist frameworks systematically dismissed as epiphenomenal or illusory. The chronological snobbery that protected Lewis from taking pre-modern thought seriously was itself a form of the bent consciousness he'd eventually diagnose. It was a defense mechanism that allowed him to maintain his atheistic materialism without engaging the strongest arguments against it. By dismissing entire intellectual traditions as outdated, he could avoid the uncomfortable work of seriously considering whether they might be right and he might be wrong. A third pattern was the systematic confusion of means and ends. People would pursue money as a means to security or pleasure, but gradually money itself would become the end, pursued even when it no longer served any actual good. They'd seek power as a means to accomplishing worthy goals, but power itself would become the goal, maintained even at the cost of destroying what they'd originally wanted to achieve. The bent consciousness systematically substituted proximate goods for ultimate goods, leaving people pursuing things that couldn't actually satisfy. Lewis saw this pattern operating in his own life during his pre-conversion years. He pursued academic success as a means to intellectual fulfillment and the opportunity to engage with great literature and ideas. But gradually, the success itself became the goal. The recognition, the prestigious position, the respect of colleagues. These things couldn't actually provide the deep satisfaction he was seeking, but he kept pursuing them because the substitution had happened beneath conscious awareness. He didn't realize he'd replaced the real goal with a proxy. This substitution created a particular kind of internal conflict. Part of him recognized that academic success wasn't providing the fulfillment it was supposed to. But rather than questioning whether he was pursuing the right things, he concluded he simply hadn't achieved enough success yet. So he worked harder, published more, sought greater recognition, all while the actual hunger remained unsatisfied because he was feeding it the wrong food. Lewis eventually recognized that this confusion of means and ends was near universal in human experience. People pursued health as if it were the ultimate good, rather than a means to living well. They sought knowledge as if information itself could satisfy when what they really wanted was wisdom. They chased pleasure as if satisfaction were the goal when what they actually longed for was joy. The bent consciousness systematically led people to pursue proximate goods as ultimate goods, which made fulfillment impossible because they were asking finite things to do infinite work. The self-deception operating at this level was particularly difficult to penetrate because it involved not just hiding uncomfortable truths from yourself, but fundamentally misidentifying what you wanted and needed. You weren't lying about your goals. You genuinely believed that success or wealth or pleasure or knowledge was what you were after. But these were proxies, substitutes, lesser goods mistaken for ultimate goods. And as long as the mistake persisted, you'd keep pursuing things that couldn't satisfy while wondering why you remained perpetually unfulfilled. Lewis saw these patterns everywhere, in himself, in his colleagues, in his students, in literature throughout history. And he saw that recognizing the patterns didn't automatically free you from them. You could know intellectually that you were caught in self-deception, could even describe it accurately, and still not escape it. The war within involved layers of insight and self-knowledge that themselves became weapons in the ongoing conflict rather than simple solutions. The bent consciousness protected itself through multiple layers of defense. When one rationalization was exposed, another would emerge. When you recognized one form of self-deception, you'd often substitute another without realizing it. The process of achieving genuine self-knowledge was like peeling an onion, layer after layer of protection and distortion, each layer seeming like the final truth until you penetrated deeper and discovered another layer beneath. This understanding transformed Lewis's approach to both intellectual work and spiritual development. He became intensely suspicious of his own motivations and perceptions, constantly questioning whether he was seeing clearly or through the distorting lens of bent consciousness. He developed what he called a hermeneutic of suspicion toward his own reasoning, always asking what hidden biases or unexamined assumptions might be shaping his conclusions. But this suspicion couldn't become paralyzing skepticism. If you couldn't trust your own consciousness at all, you couldn't function or think or make moral judgments. The solution Lewis eventually embraced was what he called mere Christianity, the core of Christian teaching that had been recognized across centuries and traditions, tested by countless individuals, and proven reliable through experience. This provided an external standard against which to measure his own perceptions and judgments, a way of correcting for the systematic distortions of bent consciousness. The war within, understood at this level, required external help. You couldn't win it through your own insight alone because your insight itself was compromised. You needed tradition, community, revelation, and ultimately divine grace to provide the corrective lens that let you see your own consciousness accurately. This wasn't intellectual surrender or the abandonment of rational thinking. It was the recognition that rational thinking itself needed guidance and correction if it was going to overcome systematic biases and distortions. Part 3. The Corruption of Desire. Lewis's most psychologically penetrating work came through his analysis of what he called disordered desire. Not the simple presence of wanting, but the systematic corruption of the wanting itself. This went far beyond traditional moral categories of right and wrong behavior. Lewis was investigating how the internal structure of desire itself becomes warped, leading people to want things that will destroy them while believing they're pursuing fulfillment. The starting point was Lewis's observation that human beings experience desires that point beyond anything the material world can satisfy. You're hungry, you eat, the hunger is satisfied. You're thirsty, you drink, the thirst is satisfied. But then there are other desires, for perfect knowledge, for complete love, for absolute beauty, for ultimate meaning, that remain perpetually unsatisfied no matter how much you pursue them through worldly means. The naturalistic explanation Lewis had held during his atheistic period was that these unfulfillable desires were evolutionary misfires, accidents of consciousness that didn't correspond to anything real. They were like the appendix, vestigial structures that had once served a purpose but now caused more problems than they solved. The mature attitude was to recognize this, adjust your expectations, and focus on desires that could actually be satisfied through material means. But Lewis found this explanation increasingly unsatisfying, both intellectually and experientially. Intellectually, it seemed strange that evolution would produce such powerful, universal, and apparently purposeless desires. If they served no function, why were they so central to human experience, driving art, philosophy, religion, and humanity's highest achievements? Experientially, these desires didn't feel like malfunctions. They felt like glimpses of something real, like homesickness for a home you'd never consciously known. Lewis began to consider what would later become one of his most distinctive philosophical contributions: the argument from desire. If you experience a desire, it's reasonable to suppose that there exists something capable of satisfying that desire. Ducks have an instinct for water before they've ever seen water, which makes sense because water exists and ducks are designed to need it. Human babies desire food before they've ever tasted food, which makes sense because food exists and humans are designed to need it. By this same logic, if humans universally experience desires that point beyond the material world, desires for transcendence, for ultimate meaning, for perfect love, doesn't this suggest that something exists capable of satisfying these desires? Not proof, perhaps, but reasonable evidence worth taking seriously. But here's where Lewis's analysis becomes subtle and psychologically sophisticated. Even if these transcendent desires point toward real transcendent realities, human beings in their bent, conditions systematically corrupt these desires, seeking to satisfy them through inadequate substitutes, which leads to a particular kind of spiritual pathology. Lewis called this the substitution of lesser goods for greater goods. A person experiences the desire for transcendent love, but rather than pursuing relationship with God and genuine self-giving love for others, they substitute sexual conquest, trying to satisfy infinite desire with finite experience. It doesn't work, can't work, but rather than recognizing the category error, they conclude they just haven't found the right partner or the right experience yet. So they keep pursuing the substitute, growing increasingly frustrated, addicted, and dissatisfied. Or someone experiences the desire for significance and meaning, but substitutes career achievement, believing that if they just accomplish enough, earn enough recognition, rise high enough in their field, they'll satisfy this longing. It doesn't work because finite achievement can't satisfy infinite desire. But rather than recognizing this, they conclude they haven't achieved enough yet, so they pursue more and more, sacrificing relationships, health, integrity, always feeling that fulfillment is just one more accomplishment away. Lewis saw this pattern repeated across every domain of human experience. People experienced desires that pointed toward God, toward infinite love, perfect truth, absolute beauty, ultimate meaning. But they tried to satisfy these desires through finite substitutes. And because the desires were infinite while the substitutes were finite, the pursuit became addictive and progressively destructive. The psychological mechanism Lewis identified was that each experience of the substitute provided a brief flicker of satisfaction, a moment when you think, this might be it, followed by inevitable disappointment when the satisfaction fades. But rather than learning that you're pursuing the wrong thing, you attribute the failure to not having enough of the substitute or not finding the right version of it. So you pursue more intensely, more desperately, in a spiral that never resolves. This is why Lewis insisted that sin, understood properly, isn't primarily about breaking rules or doing bad things. It's about the corruption of desire itself, the systematic pursuit of lesser goods as if they were ultimate goods, which makes them into destructive idols rather than proper objects of finite appreciation. The internal war is fought primarily in the realm of desire, not just in the moment of action. Lewis illustrated this through his own experience with what he called Sehnsucht, a German word meaning longing or yearning. Throughout his life, Lewis experienced moments when beauty or myth or music would evoke an intense longing, a sense of homesickness for something he couldn't name. These moments were simultaneously painful and precious. Painful because the longing was never satisfied, precious because they seemed to point towards something real and ultimately important. During his atheistic period, Lewis had tried to satisfy this longing through aesthetic experiences, reading the right books, hearing the right music, contemplating the right landscapes. But he noticed a strange pattern. The longing was most powerful when he wasn't directly pursuing it. It would come unexpectedly, triggered by some turn of phrase or quality of light or fragment of melody. But when he tried to recapture it deliberately, tried to engineer the experience or return to the trigger that had originally evoked it, the longing would evaporate. The more directly he pursued it, the more it eluded him. This taught Lewis something crucial about the structure of desire itself. The deepest human desires couldn't be satisfied by direct pursuit of the experiences that seemed to evoke them. The experiences were pointers, not objects. They were windows onto something beyond themselves, not destinations in themselves. Treating them as destinations rather than windows was precisely the corruption of desire that made fulfillment impossible. Lewis came to believe that this universal human experience of infinite desire pointed toward a transcendent reality that was the proper object of desire, not any particular experience or achievement or relationship or pleasure, but God Himself as the source and ultimate satisfaction of all human longing. The corruption happened when people tried to satisfy infinite desire with finite goods, which made them into addictive substitutes rather than proper objects of finite enjoyment. This analysis had profound implications for understanding addiction, not just to substances, but to any human good that had become idolatrous. The addict wasn't simply weak-willed or making bad choices in an obvious way. The addict was caught in a structure of corrupted desire where something finite was being pursued as if it were infinite, which made satisfaction systematically impossible and the pursuit progressively more desperate and destructive. Lewis saw this pattern not just in obvious addictions, but in the structure of modern consumer capitalism itself. The entire economic system depended on stimulating desires that couldn't be satisfied, creating artificial needs, and promising fulfillment through the next purchase. The system worked precisely because it exploited the corrupted structure of human desire, the tendency to pursue finite goods as if they were ultimate, which kept people perpetually dissatisfied and perpetually consuming. The advertising industry, Lewis noted, was essentially in the business of corrupting desire. It took legitimate needs and desires and attached them to products that couldn't actually satisfy them. You experienced loneliness, and advertising suggested that buying the right car or wearing the right clothes would provide the connection and belonging you sought. You felt inadequate, and advertising promised that purchasing their product would give you the confidence and self-worth you lacked. The promises were always implicit rather than explicit, carefully crafted to suggest satisfaction without making claims that could be factually disputed. What made this particularly insidious was that it worked. People knew intellectually that products couldn't provide love or meaning or self-worth. But the advertising created associations that operated beneath conscious awareness, linking products with deep human needs in ways that shaped desire without rational reflection. You'd find yourself wanting things not because they'd satisfy actual needs, but because they'd been connected in your imagination with needs they couldn't possibly address. Lewis recognized this wasn't just a critique of capitalism or advertising. It was a diagnosis of fallen human nature itself. The tendency to corrupt desire, to pursue finite goods as infinite, to substitute proximate satisfactions for ultimate fulfillment. This was built into human psychology after the fall. Economic systems and advertising simply exploited tendencies that were already present. In a different economic system, the same corrupted desires would manifest differently, but wouldn't disappear. The internal war at the level of desire was particularly difficult because you couldn't simply stop wanting. Human beings are constituted by their desires. The solution wasn't to eliminate desire, but to properly order it, to desire finite goods finitely and infinite goods infinitely, to enjoy creation without making created things into gods, to appreciate beauty without expecting it to provide ultimate fulfillment. But this proper ordering of desire couldn't be achieved through willpower alone. The corruption went too deep, was too systematic, operated too much beneath conscious awareness. Lewis came to believe it required what Christians called grace, divine assistance in the reordering of desire itself, not just strengthening the will to resist corrupted desires, but gradually healing the corruption so that you began to desire properly, to want what was genuinely good, and to want it in proportion to its actual goodness. This understanding transformed Lewis's approach to moral formation and spiritual development. The goal wasn't just to resist bad desires or to cultivate good desires through discipline. It was to allow divine grace to gradually transform the structure of desire itself, so that what you wanted aligned with what would actually fulfill you. This required openness to transformation, willingness to have your desires challenged and reordered, and patient cooperation with grace as it worked gradually to heal the corruption. Lewis illustrated this through various literary examples, particularly in his Narnia Chronicles. The characters who were redeemed weren't those who simply resisted obvious temptations. They were those who allowed their desires to be transformed. Edmund initially desired Turkish delight and power, but through encountering Aslan and experiencing forgiveness, his desires were gradually reordered so that he wanted different things: justice, courage, genuine relationship. The transformation wasn't primarily behavioral, but at the level of fundamental orientation and desire. The war within, at this deepest level, was about what kind of person you were becoming, not just what actions you performed. Every choice either reinforced corrupted desires or contributed to their healing and reordering. Every moment of saying yes to proper desires and no to corrupted ones was training your consciousness, gradually reshaping the structure of wanting itself. The battle was fought in small moments, choosing presence over distraction, genuine connection over manipulative relationship, difficult truth over comfortable falsehood. And these small choices accumulated into character and ultimately into destiny. Part 4. The Democracy of Death. Lewis's philosophy took its darkest turn when he confronted what he considered the ultimate equalizer, the one reality that exposed all pretension and all self-deception: death. Not the distant, abstract concept of death, but the immediate, personal experience of losing people you love and facing your own mortality without illusion. The first major encounter came with his mother's death when Lewis was 9 years old. Flora Lewis died of cancer after months of painful decline. Young Lewis had prayed desperately for her healing, believing with the confidence of childhood that if he prayed hard enough, God would surely intervene. When she died anyway, it shattered his childish faith and began a process of disillusionment that would culminate in his adolescent atheism. But it wasn't just the death itself that shaped Lewis's later philosophy. It was his retrospective recognition of what had happened to him psychologically in response to the death. He'd numbed himself, shut down emotionally, constructed protective barriers against ever being hurt that deeply again. The 9-year-old boy who'd lost his mother began transforming into the cynical young man who'd believed the universe was fundamentally meaningless. Lewis saw, with brutal clarity, how psychological self-protection could become spiritual death. You built walls to prevent being hurt, and the walls worked. You hurt less. But you also felt less, loved less, lived less. You purchased safety at the cost of your own humanity, and you convinced yourself this was maturity, realism, appropriate adjustment to reality rather than slow suicide of the soul. The war within manifested in this constant tension between the need to protect yourself from being hurt and the need to remain open, vulnerable, fully alive. Close yourself off, and you're safe but dead. Open yourself, and you're alive but endlessly vulnerable to being wounded. There seemed to be no third option, no way to be both safe and fully alive. Lewis's second major encounter with death came through the loss of friends in World War I. Not the abstract knowledge that people were dying, but the concrete reality of specific individuals he'd known and cared about simply ceasing to exist. One day, a person is there, laughing, talking, making plans. The next day, they're not, and they never will be again. The finality was absolute, undeniable, terrible. What struck Lewis most was the randomness. Good people died, while bad people survived. The brave died, and the cowardly lived. Intelligence, virtue, potential, none of it mattered. A shell landed here instead of there for no reason at all, and existence ended. If death really was the end, then nothing mattered at all in any ultimate sense. All human striving, all love, all achievement, all the things people convinced themselves were important, all of it ended in the same darkness for everyone. This should have confirmed Lewis's atheistic materialism. If consciousness was just an accident of chemistry, then of course it would end when the chemistry stopped. Death proved that human beings were just complex machines that eventually broke down and stopped functioning. There was no mystery, no deeper meaning, just the mechanical reality that all biological processes eventually ceased. But Lewis found himself unable to accept this conclusion, even though his philosophical framework insisted on it. Death felt like an enemy, not like a natural process. It felt like a violation, an insult, something wrong with reality itself. When he witnessed death, especially the death of young men whose lives were just beginning, he experienced moral outrage, not just sadness. He felt that death was wrong, that it shouldn't be this way, that there was something fundamentally broken about a reality where consciousness simply winked out of existence. Where was this moral intuition coming from if the universe was really just meaningless matter in motion? If death was natural and inevitable, and no different in kind from a machine breaking down, why did it feel like cosmic injustice? Lewis couldn't make his emotional and moral responses fit his intellectual framework. The war continued throughout his adult life, even after conversion. Lewis lost his friend Charles Williams suddenly, unexpectedly, and found that Christian belief didn't eliminate grief or make loss feel less like catastrophe. He'd developed theological frameworks for understanding death, believed intellectually in resurrection and eternal life, but none of this protected him from the raw pain of absence. The third and most devastating encounter with death came much later in Lewis's life, after his conversion to Christianity, after decades of teaching and writing. In 1956, when Lewis was 58, he married Joy Davidman, an American writer who'd come to faith partly through reading his work. It was an unexpected joy for Lewis, who'd resigned himself to permanent bachelorhood. Their marriage was brief. Joy was diagnosed with cancer shortly after they wed. There were periods of remission that gave false hope, but ultimately, the cancer won. Joy died in 1960, leaving Lewis shattered. What made this death particularly significant for Lewis's philosophy was that it came after his conversion, after he'd developed his Christian worldview, after he'd written books about suffering and theodicy. He'd thought carefully about death and suffering. He had theological frameworks for understanding them. He believed in resurrection and eternal life. None of it protected him from the raw agony of losing the person he loved. Lewis wrote about this experience in A Grief Observed, published initially under a pseudonym. The book is remarkable for its honesty about how theological beliefs don't simply override human suffering. You can believe intellectually in resurrection and still feel the absence of the beloved as an absolute loss. You can trust that death isn't the end and still experience it as catastrophic rupture. The internal war continued, even for those who'd found faith, perhaps especially for them, because now there was conflict between what you believed and what you felt. One of the most haunting passages in A Grief Observed describes Lewis's sense that grief was revealing something about his relationship with joy that he'd managed not to see while she was alive. He'd loved her, genuinely and deeply. But had he loved her as herself? Or had he loved his idea of her, the role she played in his life, the satisfaction their relationship provided him? Grief stripped away the comfortable assumptions and forced him to examine the actual nature of his love without the distorting presence of self-interest. This raised terrifying questions. If even the best human love was contaminated by self-interest and need, if you couldn't love another person purely without wanting something from them, what did that say about human nature? And how could you trust that any of your motivations were pure? That any of your seemingly virtuous actions weren't actually elaborate forms of self-service disguised as altruism? The war within, understood through the lens of grief, revealed layers of self-deception and mixed motivation that were normally invisible. You could convince yourself you were loving someone selflessly while actually using them to meet your needs. You could believe you were serving others while actually serving your own ego and need for significance. Grief exposed these comfortable lies by removing the object that had been satisfying your needs and forcing you to confront what you'd actually been doing. But through this devastating experience, Lewis discovered something crucial about the war within. The numbness he'd cultivated as a 9-year-old losing his mother, the emotional shutdown he'd developed in the trenches. These weren't solutions to the problem of suffering. They were forms of death themselves, ways of preemptively doing to yourself what death would eventually do anyway. The alternative Lewis eventually embraced was something he called drenching in reality. Instead of protecting yourself from being hurt by refusing to love deeply or feel fully, you opened yourself completely to reality in all its terror and beauty. You loved knowing you'd eventually lose what you loved. You felt fully knowing you'd eventually be hurt. You lived fully knowing you'd eventually die. This wasn't masochism or courting suffering for its own sake. It was the recognition that being human meant being vulnerable, and the attempt to eliminate vulnerability by numbing yourself eliminated humanity itself. Better to love and lose than to protect yourself from loss by never truly loving. Better to feel and be hurt than to protect yourself from hurt by never truly feeling. Lewis's mature philosophy understood the war within as fundamentally a battle between different kinds of death. There was the biological death that would eventually come for everyone. But there was also the spiritual death people chose. The slow numbing, the gradual shutdown, the progressive loss of full humanity through various forms of self-protection and self-deception. The first death was inevitable. The second death was optional. The paradox Lewis identified was that attempting to avoid hurt through emotional distance or cynical detachment actually made you less capable of bearing hurt when it came. The numbness that seemed protective was really a kind of atrophy, like muscles that weaken through disuse. People who'd carefully protected themselves from feeling too much found that when major loss came, they had no strength to bear it. They'd traded the capacity for deep joy for protection from deep sorrow, and in the process had lost both. Lewis came to see death not primarily as a philosophical problem to be solved, but as a reality to be faced with maximum consciousness and minimum self-deception. The war within was fought in how you responded to mortality, yours and others. You could face it honestly, grieve fully, love completely despite knowing loss was inevitable. Or you could shut down, numb yourself, live partially in an attempt to reduce the territory death could claim. One response led to genuine humanity and the possibility of transcendence. The other led to living death, to becoming less than human long before biological death arrived. The enemy wasn't death itself, but the internal surrender to death through numbness, cynicism, and emotional withdrawal. The war within was the fight to remain fully alive, fully loving, fully feeling, fully present in a world where everything you loved would eventually be taken from you. This understanding gave Lewis's later work a depth of compassion and realism that was absent from his earlier, more purely intellectual apologetics. He wrote not as someone who'd solved the problem of death through philosophical arguments, but as someone who'd faced it repeatedly and found that faith didn't eliminate pain, but provided resources for bearing pain without being destroyed by it, or destroying yourself through self-protective numbness. The war within, at this level, was about whether you'd allow suffering to break you open, or whether you'd let it make you hard and closed. Both responses were understandable. Both protected you in some sense. But only one preserved your humanity and allowed for the possibility of transformation through suffering rather than mere survival despite it. Part 5. The hideous strength of pride. If numbness was one face of the enemy within, pride was the other, and Lewis considered it the more dangerous because it was more subtle, more sophisticated, more capable of disguising itself as virtue. Pride wasn't simply thinking too highly of yourself. It was a systematic structure of self-deception that perverted every aspect of human psychology and made genuine spiritual growth nearly impossible. Lewis's analysis of pride went far beyond conventional moral critique. He was investigating the architecture of ego itself, the ways human consciousness constructed false versions of reality with the self at the center, and the terrible consequences this had for both individual development and human relationships. The foundation of pride, Lewis argued, was what he called the comparison game. Pride wasn't primarily about having a high opinion of yourself. You could have reasonably accurate self-assessment and still be free of pride. Pride was essentially competitive. It wasn't enough to be good, talented, or successful. You had to be better than others. Your worth came not from your actual qualities, but from your perceived superiority over other people. This created a particular kind of internal war. The proud person couldn't simply enjoy their own accomplishments or appreciate their own qualities. Everything had to be evaluated in comparison to others. A proud person couldn't be satisfied with writing a good book. They had to have written a better book than their rival. They couldn't enjoy being intelligent. They had to be more intelligent than their peers. They couldn't appreciate being loved. They had to be loved more than others, or by someone more desirable than others' partners. The psychological exhaustion of this constant comparison was tremendous, but the proud person couldn't escape it because their entire sense of self was constructed through these comparisons. Without the comparison game, they'd have to face the question of their actual worth without reference to others, and this question terrified them. So they remained trapped in perpetual competition, perpetually anxious about their standing, perpetually unable to simply be content with what they were. Lewis noted the paradox that pride was often most intense in people who seemed to have the least reason for it. The mediocre person who insisted on their superiority, the failed artist who blamed others for not recognizing their genius, the petty tyrant who demanded constant deference. These were the truly proud. Meanwhile, Genuinely accomplished people were often remarkably humble because their actual achievements had taught them how much they still didn't know and hadn't mastered. This suggested that pride wasn't really about self-assessment at all. It was a defense mechanism, a way of protecting yourself from confronting your actual limitations and failures. The proud person had to maintain a grandiose self-image precisely because their real self seemed inadequate. If they admitted their limitations, their entire psychological structure would collapse. Lewis identified several characteristic patterns of proud consciousness. One was the inability to receive criticism. The proud person couldn't accept negative feedback as potentially useful information that might help them improve. Instead, they had to reject it, rationalize it away, or attack the critic. This made growth nearly impossible because you can't improve without acknowledging areas where you're deficient. The mechanism here was subtle. The proud person didn't consciously decide to reject criticism. Rather, their psychology automatically defended against it before it could register as valid. They'd immediately find reasons why the criticism was wrong. The critic didn't understand, had bad motives, was jealous, was applying inappropriate standards. Or they'd acknowledge the criticism in principle while explaining why it didn't really apply to them. That was just a temporary mistake, special circumstances, not representative of their real abilities. This automatic defensiveness meant the proud person was trapped in their current level of development. They couldn't learn from mistakes because they couldn't fully acknowledge making mistakes. They couldn't grow in areas of weakness because they couldn't admit weakness without their entire self-image collapsing. The very mechanism that was supposed to protect their self-esteem actually prevented them from developing qualities that might justify genuine self-esteem. Another pattern was the constant need for admiration and validation. The proud person couldn't maintain their self-image through their own internal resources. They needed constant external confirmation that they were as superior as they believed themselves to be. This made them desperately dependent on others, while simultaneously contemptuous of those same others. They needed other people to validate them, but couldn't respect people who gave them validation, because obviously, anyone who thought they were great must have poor judgment. This created a particularly painful form of internal conflict. The proud person despised their own neediness, but couldn't escape it. They wanted to be completely independent, needing nothing from anyone, but actually, they were enslaved to the opinions of others. They wanted to be admired, but despised those who admired them. They wanted relationships, but couldn't have genuine relationships because they were using other people as mirrors for their self-image, rather than encountering them as real people with their own independent existence. A third pattern was the systematic inability to apologize or admit fault. The proud person couldn't say, "I was wrong," because this challenged their fundamental self-image of superiority. So they'd rationalize, make excuses, shift blame, do anything except simply admit error. This poisoned relationships because genuine relationship required mutual acknowledgement of imperfection and mutual willingness to repair ruptures through honest admission of fault. Lewis saw pride operating not just in individuals, but in entire cultures and intellectual movements. Academic pride that couldn't admit the value in older or less sophisticated traditions. Ideological pride that couldn't acknowledge any truth in opposing viewpoints. Scientific pride that dismissed as meaningless any questions that couldn't be answered through empirical methods. Moral pride that felt superior to those with different ethical commitments rather than engaging their arguments seriously. But perhaps Lewis's most penetrating insight concerned spiritual pride, the pride that infected religious people and spiritual seekers. This was particularly insidious because it disguised itself as humility. The spiritually proud person prided themselves on their humility, which created a perfect self-reinforcing system. They were humble about their accomplishments. "Look how humble I am," which was itself a source of pride. They condemned pride in others while being blind to their own. Lewis had experienced this firsthand during his conversion process. As he moved from atheism toward faith, he noticed how his pride constantly interfered with honest investigation. He'd encounter arguments for theism that he couldn't rationally refute, but he'd resist them anyway, because accepting them would mean admitting he'd been wrong, that the Christians he'd dismissed had been right. His pride preferred intellectual consistency with his past positions over truth. This was perhaps the most painful aspect of Lewis's internal war during his conversion. His intellect was being convinced, but his pride was resisting. He could see that the arguments for Christianity were stronger than the arguments for atheism, but he didn't want to convert because conversion would mean humiliation. He'd have to admit he'd been wrong about the most fundamental questions. He'd have to acknowledge that people he'd considered intellectually inferior had been right while he'd been wrong. His pride found this prospect unbearable. The war within, at the level of pride, was fought in these moments when truth challenged ego. You could follow the truth where it led, even when that meant admitting you'd been wrong, changing your position, acknowledging that people you dismissed were right. Or you could protect your ego by rationalizing away uncomfortable evidence, attacking those who challenged your views, constructing elaborate defenses for positions you held primarily because abandoning them would injure your pride. Lewis came to see that you couldn't win this war through direct assault on pride itself. Trying to become humble through focusing on your pride was like trying to see your eyes by looking harder. The very attempt reinforced the thing you were trying to overcome. The proud person who recognized their pride and tried to eliminate it often became proud of their humility, creating layers of meta-pride that were even harder to penetrate. The solution Lewis eventually identified wasn't fighting pride directly, but losing interest in yourself altogether. Real humility wasn't thinking less of yourself. It was thinking of yourself less. It was becoming so absorbed in truth, beauty, goodness, other people, and ultimately God, that you simply forgot about yourself and your standing relative to others. You didn't compare yourself to anyone because you weren't thinking about yourself at all. This required what Lewis called the expulsive power of a new affection. You couldn't eliminate pride by hating it or fighting it directly. You could only transcend it by becoming fascinated with something more interesting than yourself. As long as you remained self-focused, even self-focused in the mode of trying to eliminate pride, you remained trapped in the comparison game. Lewis illustrated this through literature, particularly his Screwtape Letters, where a senior demon instructs a junior tempter on how to corrupt souls. One key strategy the demons use is keeping people focused on themselves, either in positive self-admiration or in negative self-condemnation. Both modes kept consciousness self-centered. The goal was to prevent people from losing themselves in genuine love, work, beauty, or truth. because such self-forgetting made them inaccessible to pride's corruption. In one particularly insightful passage, Screwtape explains how to corrupt humility itself. The demon teaches his nephew to let the human become aware of their own humility, to think, "What an admirable, humble person I am." The moment humility becomes an object of attention, it ceases to be humility and becomes pride in disguise. True humility is self-forgetfulness so complete that you're not even aware of being humble. The internal war against pride was thus paradoxical. You couldn't win it by fighting it directly, only by turning your attention elsewhere. But you couldn't simply ignore pride because it would continue operating unconsciously if left unexamined. The solution required a kind of strategic awareness, recognizing pride when it arose, not to fight it, but to redirect attention toward what was genuinely valuable and interesting beyond the self. Lewis saw this pattern throughout the spiritual life. The things that most deeply corrupted human consciousness, pride, self-deception, the corruption of desire, couldn't be eliminated through direct assault. They had to be transcended through proper orientation toward what was real and ultimately valuable. The war within was won, not by violence against yourself, but by properly ordering your loves and redirecting your attention toward what deserved it. This understanding transformed how Lewis approached teaching and spiritual direction. He didn't try to make people feel guilty about their pride or to directly attack their self-regard. Instead, he tried to redirect their attention toward things genuinely worthy of attention: great literature, profound ideas, beauty in nature and art, the needs of other people, and ultimately God. When consciousness was properly directed outward toward worthy objects, pride naturally diminished, not because it was fought, but because it was forgotten. Part 6. The Weight of Glory. If Lewis's analysis of the internal war had ended with pride and numbness and corrupted desire, it would have been powerfully insightful, but ultimately hopeless. What transformed his philosophy from diagnostic to therapeutic was his vision of what human beings were actually meant to become, what he called the weight of glory that was the proper destiny of human consciousness. This wasn't simple optimism or wishful thinking. Lewis's vision of human potential emerged from his careful analysis of desire itself, particularly those desires that seemed to point beyond anything material reality could satisfy. If you took these desires seriously, rather than dismissing them as evolutionary accidents or psychological illusions, they suggested something profound about human nature and human destiny. Lewis noticed that human beings experience themselves as incomplete, as works in progress, as seeds waiting to germinate into something more substantial. This wasn't just dissatisfaction with present circumstances that better external conditions could remedy. It was more fundamental, a sense that your current state of consciousness itself was preparatory, that you were becoming something you weren't yet, that your present self was like a sketch awaiting the finished painting. The naturalistic explanation was that this sense of incompleteness was either illusion or the result of comparing yourself to others who seemed more complete. But Lewis found these explanations inadequate. The incompleteness felt like ontological truth, not psychological error. And it remained even when you weren't comparing yourself to anyone, even in moments of genuine accomplishment or satisfaction. Lewis began to consider the possibility that this sense of incompleteness was actually accurate, that human beings in their present state really were incomplete, really were in process towards something more substantial, really were seeds meant to grow into something barely imaginable from the perspective of present consciousness. The Christian teaching that had initially seemed most fantastic to Lewis, the doctrine of resurrection and eternal life, began to appear as the most realistic assessment of human nature. Not realistic in the sense of fitting current scientific paradigms, but realistic in the sense of taking human experience seriously, acknowledging the genuine facts of consciousness that materialistic frameworks dismissed as epiphenomena or illusions. What if the desires that seem to point beyond material satisfaction really did point beyond it? What if human beings really were designed for immortality, for transformation into glorified consciousness, for participation in divine life itself? What if the sense of incompleteness wasn't a bug, but a feature, an accurate perception of current limitations that would eventually be transcended? This vision transformed how Lewis understood the internal war. The battle wasn't just against particular vices or toward particular virtues. It was part of a process of transformation, of becoming the kind of consciousness capable of bearing the weight of glory, the fullness of what human beings were meant to become. Lewis recognized that his current consciousness couldn't adequately imagine this future state. You couldn't understand, from the perspective of a caterpillar, what it would be like to be a butterfly. The categories of experience were too different. But you could recognize that transformation was real, that present struggles were part of the process, that the war within was the necessary labor of spiritual birth. This meant that every choice, every small decision, every moment of either succumbing to or resisting numbness, pride, corrupted desire, all of it mattered in ways far exceeding their apparent significance. You weren't just choosing particular actions or cultivating particular character traits. You were choosing what kind of being you would become, whether you would develop toward the glorious fulfillment of human potential or atrophy into something less than human. Lewis illustrated this through various metaphors and images. Human beings were like blocks of stone from which sculptures would be carved, or like musical instruments being tuned, or like fields being prepared for planting. The process was often uncomfortable. Stones had to be chiseled, strings had to be tightened, fields had to be plowed. But discomfort wasn't evidence of error. It was evidence that transformation was occurring. The war within took on cosmic significance in this light. It wasn't just psychological struggle or ethical self-improvement. It was participation in the divine creative process, the working out of human destiny, the gradual transformation of consciousness from its current limited and damaged state towards something glorious beyond current comprehension. But Lewis was careful to avoid the pitfalls of perfectionism. The goal wasn't to achieve flawlessness in present life or to eliminate all struggle and imperfection. The transformation was gradual, would continue beyond death, and depended fundamentally on grace rather than human effort alone. What mattered was the direction of movement. Whether you were opening yourself to transformation or closing yourself against it, whether you were cooperating with grace or resisting it. Lewis saw the internal war as having both moral and ontological dimensions. Morally, you were choosing between good and evil, truth and falsehood, love and selfishness. But ontologically, you were choosing between different kinds of being, between becoming more real or less real, more conscious or more numb, more integrated or more fragmented, more human or less human. The strange paradox Lewis identified was that becoming more fully human required becoming more than merely human, participating in divine life, being transformed by grace into something exceeding natural human capacities. The fully human person wasn't just a well-functioning biological and psychological organism. It was a being that had been elevated, transfigured, made capable of consciousness and relationship beyond what nature alone could produce. This vision gave the internal war ultimate meaning and purpose. Every small victory against numbness, every moment of genuine presence rather than self-protective withdrawal, every choice of love over pride, every redirection of corrupted desire toward proper objects, all of it contributed to the transformation. Nothing was wasted. Even failures could become materials for growth when faced honestly rather than rationalized away. Lewis came to see that the weight of glory, this transformation toward full humanity and participation in divine life, was both gift and task. It was gift because you couldn't achieve it through your own effort. It required grace, divine assistance in remaking consciousness. But it was also task because grace didn't override human will, but worked through human cooperation. You had to consent to transformation, had to open yourself to grace, had to work out your salvation with fear and trembling, even though God was the ultimate source of growth. The internal war was thus participation in the creative work of God, the bringing of new consciousness into existence, the fulfillment of human potential that had been designed into human nature from the beginning, but required cultivation and grace to actualize. This gave every moment infinite significance, while simultaneously removing the crushing burden of believing you had to accomplish transformation through your own efforts. Lewis's vision of glory also addressed the problem of meaning in a way that neither pure naturalism nor simplistic religious belief could match. Naturalism said human life had no ultimate meaning. You lived, you died, your consciousness ended, and nothing you did mattered in any cosmic sense. Simplistic religion said you followed rules to get a reward after death, reducing morality to prudent self-interest and heaven to an eternal vacation. Lewis's vision was far more profound. Human life had meaning because you were participating in something cosmic and eternal, because the choices you made now were forming you into a particular kind of being, because the war within was actually the process by which consciousness was being prepared for glorious fulfillment. Morality wasn't arbitrary rules or prudent self-interest. It was guidance for how to cooperate with your own transformation, how to become what you were meant to be. And heaven wasn't a reward unrelated to who you'd become. It was the natural fulfillment of a process begun in this life, the full flowering of seeds planted through your daily choices and struggles. You weren't earning heaven through good behavior. You were becoming the kind of person capable of enjoying heaven. Or you were becoming the kind of person who would find heaven unbearable because you'd made yourself allergic to reality itself. This understanding meant that the stakes of the internal war couldn't be higher. You weren't just choosing whether to be a slightly better or worse version of yourself. You were choosing your eternal destiny, what kind of being you'd become forever, whether you'd participate in divine glory or fade into unreality through persistent self-enclosure and self-deception. Part 7. The Great Divorce. Lewis's most psychologically sophisticated contribution to understanding the internal war came through his exploration of what he called the Great Divorce. The the gradual separation between people who were becoming more real through openness to truth and transformation, and people who were becoming less real through various forms of self-enclosure and self-deception. The image Lewis developed was of hell not as a place of active torture, but as a condition of progressive unreality. People in hell weren't being punished from outside, but were experiencing the natural consequences of their own choices. Every choice for falsehood over truth, for self-protection over vulnerability, for pride over humility, for corrupted desire over proper love, made you slightly less real, less substantial, less genuinely existent. This wasn't metaphor. Lewis meant it literally. Reality, he argued, wasn't a neutral medium in which all choices were equally valid. Reality had structure, direction, purpose. Aligning yourself with truth made you more real. Divorcing yourself from truth made you less real. The ultimate destination of persistent self-deception and self-enclosure was a kind of ontological fading, becoming a grumbler, a ghost, a nothing. Lewis illustrated this through various examples of how small choices accumulated into character and how character determined destiny. A person who consistently chose comfort over challenge became progressively more comfort-dependent and less capable of bearing difficulty. A person who habitually lied to avoid consequences found that truth itself became harder to perceive. They'd trained themselves not to see it. A person who nursed grievances found that grievance nursing became their primary mode of relating to reality. The terrifying thing about this process was that it was progressive and eventually irreversible. The choices became easier and easier because you were becoming the kind of person for whom those choices were natural. You weren't fighting temptation. You'd become temptation. You weren't making bad choices. You'd become a bad chooser. At some point, the transformation became complete and permanent. You'd fully divorced yourself from reality, from truth, from God, from your own deepest nature. This was Lewis's most haunting insight about the internal war. You could lose it so gradually, so incrementally, that you never noticed the transformation until it was complete. Each individual choice seemed small, justifiable, no big deal. But choices accumulated into habits, habits into character, character into destiny. You became what you repeatedly chose, and eventually you couldn't choose differently because you'd made yourself into a being who couldn't want to choose differently. Lewis saw this pattern operating not just in dramatic moral failures, but in mundane, everyday compromises. The person who repeatedly chose to scroll through their phone instead of engaging with discomfort gradually lost the capacity for sustained attention and depth of engagement. The person who habitually avoided difficult conversations gradually lost the ability to tolerate conflict and work through disagreement. The person who chronically numbed themselves with entertainment gradually lost access to their own deeper emotions and desires. None of these individual choices seemed catastrophic. You could always rationalize them. Just this once. I'm tired. I'll do better tomorrow. Everyone does it. It's not that big a deal. But the cumulative effect was transformation in the wrong direction. Movement away from reality rather than toward it. Progressive diminishment rather than growth. The opposite pattern was equally gradual, but led toward glorification rather than dissolution. Small choices for truth over comfortable falsehood, for presence over numbness, for vulnerability over self-protection, for love over pride. These accumulated into character that was more real, more substantial, more genuinely existent. You became capable of more consciousness, more relationship, more participation in reality itself. Lewis illustrated this through his fiction, particularly The Great Divorce, which depicted souls from hell visiting heaven and being offered the chance to stay. The striking thing was that most refused. They'd become so invested in their grievances, their self-pity, their pride, their comfortable falsehoods, that they experienced reality itself as threatening and painful. They preferred the gray unreality of hell to the overwhelming reality of heaven. This wasn't because heaven was cruel or exclusionary. It was because the souls had made themselves into beings who couldn't tolerate reality. Like people who'd been in darkness so long that light hurt their eyes, these souls had divorced themselves from truth so completely that truth itself was unbearable. They weren't locked out of heaven. They were locked into their own choices and the character those choices had formed. The application to the internal war was clear. Every moment presented a choice, however small, between reality and unreality, between truth and comfortable falsehood, between genuine presence and various forms of self-protective withdrawal. These choices seemed small in the moment, but they were literally choosing what kind of being you would become, whether you would move toward greater reality or toward progressive dissolution. Lewis saw modern culture as largely organized around making the wrong choices easier and the right choices harder. Entertainment and distraction were everywhere, making it easy to avoid consciousness. Social media provided constant opportunities for pride and comparison, making it hard to forget yourself. Consumer culture continuously stimulated corrupted desire, making it difficult to order your loves properly. Everything conspired to keep you numbed, proud, and wrongly desiring, rather than awake, humble, and properly loving. The internal war in this context required what Lewis called vigilance, constant attention to the small choices and their cumulative direction. Not paranoid self-monitoring or exhausting perfectionism, but gentle, persistent awareness of whether you are moving toward reality or away from it, toward genuine consciousness or toward various forms of living death. Lewis recognized that this vigilance couldn't be maintained through willpower alone. You needed external support, community, spiritual disciplines, regular practices that interrupted the drift toward unreality and reoriented you toward truth. You needed regular reminders of what you were choosing between, because the stakes of small choices weren't immediately apparent, and you'd forget if not regularly reminded. Most importantly, you needed grace, divine assistance in the transformation that you couldn't accomplish through your own efforts. The good news was that grace was always available, always working to draw you toward reality, always offering chances to turn and choose differently. The bad news was that grace could be refused, and persistent refusal gradually made you into a being incapable of accepting it. The Great Divorce happened gradually, almost imperceptibly, through accumulated small choices over decades. But the final separation was absolute, between those who'd become substantially real through openness to transformation and those who'd faded into unreality through self-enclosure and self-deception. The war within determined which side of that divorce you'd end up on, and the battle was fought primarily in moments so small you might not even notice them as choices at all. Lewis's vision here was both terrifying and liberating. Terrifying because it revealed the cosmic stakes of everyday choices that seemed trivial. Liberating because it meant your life wasn't determined by grand dramatic moments, but by small, daily decisions that were within your power to make differently. You didn't need to be a hero or achieve something extraordinary. You just needed to choose truth over falsehood, presence over numbness, love over pride, in the small moments that comprised most of life. Conclusion: the eternal campaign. And so we arrive at the end of our journey through Lewis's understanding of the war within. But understanding is just the beginning. The war continues, fought in this very moment, in the choice you make after you finish listening to these words, whether to engage with what you've heard or to numb yourself, whether to remain present or to distract yourself, whether to let truth challenge your comfortable patterns or to rationalize them away. Lewis's genius wasn't just in diagnosing the war, but in showing that awareness of the war was itself part of the war. You're not a neutral observer evaluating his ideas. You're a participant whose consciousness is being shaped by how you engage with them. The numbness, the pride, the corrupted desire, the gradual divorce from reality. These aren't abstract problems happening to other people. They're operating in you, right now, in how you're responding to these very words. The enemy isn't violence or obvious evil or dramatic moral failure. The enemy is the slow drift, the comfortable numbness, the subtle self-deceptions, the small choices that seem insignificant but accumulate into character and destiny. The war is fought in the moment when you're uncomfortable and reach for your phone, in the conversation where you could engage honestly or could perform, in the relationship where you could remain vulnerable or could protect yourself through cynicism. Lewis spent his life exploring this war from every angle, through philosophy and fiction, through autobiography and apologetics, through literary criticism and imaginative myth. But every approach led to the same essential insight. Human consciousness is either moving toward greater reality and participation in divine life, or toward progressive unreality and self-enclosure. There's no neutral ground. You're always choosing, even when you think you're not choosing, and the choices are making you into something. The weight of glory that's your potential destiny is more wonderful than you can imagine from your current perspective. But reaching it requires staying awake, remaining present, choosing truth over comfortable falsehood, vulnerability over self-protection, love over pride, proper desire over corrupted substitutes. It requires fighting the internal war with awareness and persistence, knowing that every small victory matters infinitely and every small defeat has consequences. This isn't meant to create anxiety or paranoia. Lewis would say that constant fearful self-monitoring is itself a form of the self-enclosure that's the real enemy. What's needed is more like gentle, persistent attention, noticing when you're drifting toward numbness and choosing presence, noticing when pride is operating and redirecting attention elsewhere, noticing when desire is corrupted and seeking proper objects. And underlying all of it is Lewis's conviction that you're not alone in this war. Grace is real, actively working to transform you, offering assistance in the internal campaign that you couldn't win through your own efforts alone. The war requires your cooperation, your consent, your active participation. But the ultimate power for transformation comes from beyond yourself, from the divine love that's calling you toward full humanity and glorified consciousness. The battle continues tomorrow morning when you wake up. In the first moment of consciousness, you'll face a choice: to begin the day present and intentional, or to immediately escape into distraction. In your first interaction with another person, you'll choose whether to genuinely see them or to use them. In your response to difficulty, you'll choose courage or avoidance. In your moments alone, you'll choose consciousness or numbness. These aren't dramatic, obvious choices. They're the small, subtle decisions that comprise most of life, and that's precisely why they matter so much. The war within isn't won or lost in rare moments of dramatic crisis. It's won or lost in the accumulation of small choices that form character and determine destiny. Lewis understood this better than almost anyone, and his life and work stand as testimony to the possibility of transformation through honest engagement with the internal struggle. May you wake tomorrow with new awareness of the war you're fighting and new resources for fighting it well. May you choose reality over comfortable unreality, presence over numbness, love over pride, truth over self-deception. May you remember that the stakes are infinite. You're choosing what kind of being to become, whether to move toward the weight of glory or toward progressive dissolution into nothing. The war continues. Fight it with awareness, courage, honesty, and hope. And rest tonight, knowing that grace is real, transformation is possible, and the deepest truth about reality is that love is more fundamental than death, consciousness more real than matter, and your ultimate destiny more glorious than you can currently imagine. Good night. Sleep deeply, and wake ready for the campaign that continues tomorrow and every day until you've been fully transformed into the being you were always meant to become. The enemy is numbness. The battle is for your soul. And the victory, though hard won through countless small choices, is offered freely to anyone willing to remain awake, stay present, and choose truth over comfortable falsehood in the moments that seem too small to matter, but actually determine everything. Rest now. The war will be there tomorrow, but so will grace. So will the possibility of transformation. So will the chance to choose differently, to move one small step closer to the weight of glory that's your true destiny. Sleep well, fight well, and may you become, through countless small victories in the internal war, the glorious being you were always meant to be.